My name is Lauren. I'm 43 years old and I live in Raleigh, North Carolina. Most people around here think I'm just a housewife who spends her days grocery shopping, folding laundry, and waiting for her husband to get home. That's not untrue, not entirely. I do keep the house clean and I do cook most nights. But what they don't see is what happens when the house is empty and my laptop is open. I'm the CEO of BioSerenity, a biotech firm that distributes diagnostic tools across hospital networks nationwide. Last quarter alone, we brought in over 36 million in revenue. I built it from scratch piece by piece while the world assumed I was just waiting for my husband to bring home dinner. Brian, my husband, still doesn't know the full truth. To him, I'm his supportive wife, the woman who reminds him to pay bills, the one who lets him vent about office politics, without ever mentioning that the company he works for is partially reliant on contracts I signed. He thinks I spend my days watching daytime TV and wondering what to make for lunch. That illusion used to bother me. I wanted to be seen to be known, especially by the person who once held my hand and promised we'd build a life together. But after a while, I realized something. Some men aren't afraid of strong women. They're afraid of needing them. So I stayed quiet. I let him believe I was soft, dependent, harmless. I let the world think I was lucky to have him. It made things easier for a time. But when people stop seeing you, they start treating you like you're not there at all. And that's when something inside you shifts. Something deep, something quiet, something that waits. I used to think being invisible gave me peace. Now I see it gave me power, and I held on to it even as everything else in my life started to crack. That silence I chose. It wasn't weakness, it was strategy, because one day I knew I'd need it. Brian wasn't always the man he became. When we first met, he was warm and curious, the kind of person who noticed the details most people missed. He remembered my coffee order before I ever said it out loud, and he used to tilt his head when I laughed like it was something rare. He asked about my day with real interest back then, held my hand just because. When I looked at him, I saw someone I could grow old with. We married after 10 months. I thought we shared the same values, the same quiet hopes, but it didn't take long for the edges to show. At first, it was small things. He'd brush off my suggestions with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. When his job at the logistics firm started draining him, I offered help the only way I knew how. There was a position open in my company's operations team, a non-executive role with a decent salary and room to grow. I never told him I had arranged for HR to hold the spot under a fake name until he made a decision. When I told him about it just as a suggestion, he scoffed, said he didn't need me fixing his life, said he was a man who made his own way and didn't need handouts, especially not from his wife. I remember sitting in the kitchen afterwards, still holding the tea I made for him. It had gone cold by the time I poured it out. That night, he didn't say goodnight when he went to bed. From there, the distance grew. Every month, I transferred $1,200 into his personal account just to help ease things. He burned through it in less than 2 weeks on sports gear and phone upgrades, then complained about the cost of groceries, like I was the one being careless. When I questioned it, even gently, he shut down. Sometimes he'd mutter things about how I didn't understand real work or what it was like to carry pressure. And I just nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to argue. It wasn't the money. I could have wired him 20 times that and not blinked. What hurt was the way he looked past me like I was furniture, like my presence was assumed and unimportant. There were nights he didn't even ask if I'd eaten. Days I'd come home from a client pitch with sore feet and a tired voice, only to hear him complain about the remote not being in the right place. He once blamed me for the car battery dying even though I hadn't driven the car in weeks. I still remember the time my mother came to visit. She brought lasagna, the one she always made when I was a little girl and sick with the flu. I was in back-to-back meetings that day and barely had time to greet her properly. Brian walked in, dropped his bag, saw her sitting on the couch and sighed so loud it made her pause mid-sentence. Then he muttered something about how our house had become a revolving door of guests and how he never got any peace. My mom stood up slowly and said maybe she should come back another day. I watched her eyes drop, her shoulders fold in. I didn't say much after that. Later that night, I asked Brian if he realized how dismissive he'd been. He shrugged and said people needed to respect space. Said if I had a problem with it, maybe I should rethink inviting people over without asking him first. I didn't cry that night. I just stared at the ceiling in our bedroom, wondering how we'd ended up so far apart, without ever moving. The silence between us was thick by then, like fog that never lifted. He grew more impatient, snapped over towels not folded a certain way, got angry when I forgot to buy his brand of cereal. Once, when I had a fever and could barely keep water down, he stood at the bedroom door and said I needed to get better quickly because he didn't have time to play nurse. That was when something inside me cracked. Not loudly, just a quiet break like ice shifting under pressure. But I stayed. I stayed because I thought that's what love required. I thought it was about patience and sacrifice, about letting things pass so the boat wouldn't rock too hard. I didn't tell anyone, not even my mother. I still answered her calls with a smile in my voice, still posted anniversary photos with captions that meant nothing. There was a night, just one, where I thought about packing a bag and leaving, but I didn't. I brushed my hair, took a deep breath, and reminded myself that sometimes love means holding on longer than you want to. Now I realize that wasn't love. It was fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of admitting that maybe the person I trusted most didn't deserve to be beside me at all. It happened during a strategy review meeting. I had barely made it through the first hour when the room started to tilt. I remember gripping the edge of the table, trying to hide the shake in my hands, then everything faded to black. The next thing I saw was the ceiling of a hospital room. The lights were dim, my throat was dry, and there was an IV in my arm. A nurse was adjusting a monitor and told me I had fainted from exhaustion. They ran more tests. I thought it was just stress, maybe a virus. But 2 days later, a doctor sat across from me and said the words I never expected to hear. Early stage pancreatic cancer. He said it gently, like he was handing me something fragile. My hands were cold the entire time he spoke. He said they caught it early, said we had a chance. I nodded like I understood, but I didn't feel like I was in my own body anymore. That night, I texted Brian, told him I was in the hospital and needed to talk. No reply. I called twice. Voicemail. I stared at the screen for a long time as if my silence could pull him toward me. The next day, I started treatment. Alone. My mother thought I was in Phoenix for a client summit. I didn't want her to worry. The first round hit me harder than I expected. My appetite disappeared. My body felt like it was floating 1 minute and heavy the next. The nurses were kind. They offered blankets and quiet conversation. But at night, when the halls emptied and the machines clicked softly, the loneliness hit in waves. I kept checking my phone, hoping maybe Brian would surprise me, hoping maybe this would be the moment he remembered how to care. But the screen stayed dark, and so did everything else. I watched my reflection change. First the pallor, then the hair thinning, then the deep lines around my eyes. I didn't cry. I just stared and kept reminding myself that I was still here. I stopped waiting after the 4th day. I stopped hoping after the 7th. I started making plans instead. Not escape plans, survival ones. Somewhere between the 3rd infusion and the 5th sleepless night, I realized I had spent too long believing someone else would show up to save me. It had always been me. Even when I didn't feel strong, I had always been the one keeping things together. I just didn't want to believe that love could be so absent in the moment I needed it most. But now I knew, and I wasn't going to forget it. He showed up on a Thursday afternoon 2 weeks into my treatment. I almost didn't recognize him at first. He stood at the door like he had wandered into the wrong room, hands in his pockets, eyes flat. I said his name soft, more out of habit than hope. He didn't answer right away, just walked over to the small table beside my bed and placed a manila folder on it. He said he was filing for divorce, that the house and the car should go to him because it only made sense considering my condition. I didn't speak. He kept going, said it wasn't personal, that life had to move on and he couldn't be tied to something uncertain. He meant me. I was the uncertain thing. I looked at the folder but didn't touch it. My hand stayed under the blanket. My chest didn't rise any faster. He waited for a response. I gave him one, quiet and almost bored. Pick what you want. Thank you for coming. He blinked. Maybe he expected a meltdown. Maybe he thought I'd beg. But I just nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to waste another breath on him. Not anymore. He turned toward the door, said one more thing before leaving. Something smug about how I didn't really have a choice. I watched him leave like I was watching someone else's story. I didn't cry, not then. Instead, I smiled, just a little. It wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile you give when something finally clicks. The kind that comes after a long silence. The kind that says, now I know. He thought I was done. That he could carve me out of the life I built and walk away with everything. He had no idea what I had kept hidden. When the door clicked shut, I reached for the hospital phone. My hands didn't shake. I called Marcus, my CFO, and said 6 words. I need your help with something. He paused, then said he'd been waiting for this call. I said, good, let's begin. I lay back on the pillows, the afternoon light breaking across my face. And for the first time since the diagnosis, I felt clear. Not safe, not healed, just ready. Marcus didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. He had been with me since the beginning, back when BioSerenity was still 3 people in a shared co-working space, and I worked under an alias to protect my privacy. We had always kept my name off official contracts. I used my mother's maiden name on everything, even the IRS filings. I wanted a life that was mine, not a weapon for someone else to wield. The contract Brian's company depended on was one I had approved myself almost a year ago. At the time, he'd come home beaming, saying he'd helped land a major biotech partner that would boost their revenue for the entire quarter. I had smiled and said that was great. What I didn't say was that I had been the one who gave final sign-off, that I'd read his name on the proposal, evaluated his team's numbers, and decided to go ahead because it made business sense, not because of him. Now I told Marcus to end it. No explanation in the termination letter, just a simple professional closure. The document went out Monday morning at 8. By 3 that afternoon, I got a call from the CEO of Brian's firm wanting clarification. I said we had internal reasons and thanked him for the partnership. He asked if it had anything to do with a specific employee. I told him I wasn't at liberty to say, then ended the call with a tone that said not to ask again. Brian came home that evening looking pale and confused. His eyes darted as he opened the fridge like he was searching for something to ground him. He didn't speak right away. When he finally did, his voice cracked. Said he got laid off, that the company had lost a huge contract out of nowhere and started downsizing immediately. I set my book down, walked to the desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out a file. I placed it on the table between us and looked at him. Then I said, I know, I'm the one who ended it. He laughed at first like I had told a bad joke. Then he looked closer at the folder. His hand started to shake. He opened it and saw the internal paperwork. My name, my title, the signature that matched the one from the original contract he had once bragged about winning. He stared at me like he didn't know who I was, and maybe he didn't, maybe he never had. I told him everything, that I had started BioSerenity from the ground up, that I had watched him take credit for work he barely understood, that I had paid for his comfort without ever needing thanks. He didn't interrupt. He couldn't. I told him about the monthly transfers, the debt I cleared for him, the favors I pulled when his cousin needed help, all while he treated me like a shadow. Then I told him about the divorce countersuit, that he had 30 days to leave the house which I had purchased under a trust years ago, that I would no longer be covering the mortgage. His mouth opened then closed again. He didn't know what to say. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I just stood still and waited for it all to land. He tried to speak, said it couldn't be true. I handed him the legal notice confirming every word. The man who once told me I didn't understand responsibility now stood in the home I had paid for, surrounded by the silence of his own unraveling. I felt no rage, only relief. He had believed I was the one who needed saving, the weak one, the dependent wife. But the truth had always been the opposite. He had lived in a world I quietly built on a foundation he never noticed. And now, piece by piece, I was pulling it back. Not out of spite, but because I finally remembered who I was. The hospital room phone rang just after midnight. I was awake, lying still in the dark, listening to the soft hum of the oxygen vent. When I saw his name on the screen, I didn't flinch. I let it ring once more before picking up. His voice came through hoarse and shaky, like he'd been crying for hours. He said my name like it was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. He begged. Said he'd lost the house, the car, the job. Said no one else would hire him now that his friends stopped answering his calls. I stayed silent. He kept talking, told me I had been right all along. He said he finally saw it, that I was the one who made our life work, that everything good he had came from me. I closed my eyes and listened, not because I cared, but because I wanted to remember what it sounded like when the lie fell apart. He asked for another chance, said we could rebuild, said he had changed. His voice broke on the word forgiveness. I didn't answer, not right away. Then I asked a question. Do you remember Sophia? He froze. I could hear it in the way his breathing changed. He whispered something like a denial, but it came out half-formed. I spoke slowly. The CEO of his company had mentioned a complaint during their internal review. Said they looked into his late-night meetings with a young intern. Said her name was Sophia Bennett. I told him I had screenshots, Time-stamped messages, hotel records, even selfies they had taken in the office break room. He stammered, said it wasn't serious, that it was a mistake, that it meant nothing. I told him that didn't matter. In the state of North Carolina, infidelity during marriage was grounds for civil damages, and I intended to file. He started crying, said I was being cruel, that he was already at his lowest. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't insult him, I told him the truth. You chose this. Every lie, every silence, every time you made me feel small. You chose it long before I ever responded. He said he didn't know what he was doing back then, that he was lost, that he thought I didn't love him anymore. I reminded him I had cooked for him while battling nausea, sent him money while hooked to an IV, hid my pain so he wouldn't feel guilty. I reminded him I had been loyal, quiet, present, until I realized none of it mattered to him. He asked if there was any hope, if I could give him even a sliver of kindness. I told him I already had. I hung up, blocked his number. Then I emailed my attorney and authorized the next step in the civil claim. Not for revenge, for truth, for the record to reflect what really happened. The next morning, I sat by the hospital window sipping tea someone from the staff had kindly brought me. The sun had barely risen, but the air already felt different. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt anymore. I just felt done. There's power in stillness, in not explaining yourself to someone who never listened, in letting silence be the last thing they hear. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks, and I didn't dream of him. The day they told me I was clear was quiet. No fanfare, no dramatic moment, just a doctor looking me in the eye and saying the words I had been too tired to hope for. I nodded, smiled, and let myself exhale for the first time in months. 2 weeks later, I packed what I needed and left Raleigh behind. I didn't tell many people, just Marcus, my assistant, and the woman who cleaned my office. The house I chose sat by a lake in Montana, small and tucked behind rows of pine. It wasn't flashy, that was the point. Each morning I made tea and sat on the porch watching the light shift across the water. My body felt slower, lighter, like it was still learning how to be at ease. I didn't rush it. The hair I lost had started to grow back. Not thick yet, but soft, like something brave learning how to return. I didn't think much about the past, not out of denial, just because there was finally room for something else. I planted herbs along the side fence, bought a canoe I hadn't used yet, spent whole days doing nothing and felt no guilt for it. One Saturday, Marcus came by. He brought groceries I didn't ask for and stayed until the sun began to lower. We sat on the porch with warm mugs and no particular topic. He looked at me half smiling and asked if I thought I'd ever fall in love again. I didn't laugh. I just said maybe someday, but not now. He nodded and didn't press. He understood. That love, real love, wasn't supposed to cost everything. I told him I had finally learned what peace sounded like, that it wasn't silence out of fear but quiet out of choice. When he left, I stood on the dock and watched the sky bleed into the water. The air smelled like earth and wind. It was enough. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore, not even to myself. I had already done the hardest part. I had let go, and in doing that, I had begun again. Sometimes strength looks like silence, not the kind that keeps you small, but the kind that walks away without needing to explain. I used to believe love meant staying even when it hurt. But now I know the real courage is choosing yourself when someone else refuses to. There is nothing noble in waiting for someone to see your worth. Your value doesn't depend on how loudly they miss you once you're gone. The hardest lesson I ever learned was that being needed isn't the same as being loved, and being invisible in your own life is the slowest kind of heartbreak. I carried that weight for too long. Now I carry something different, quiet, steady, mine. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt unseen, I want you to know you're not alone, and you don't have to wait for someone else to wake up to your light. You are allowed to leave. You are allowed to start over, and you are allowed to become someone new. So let me ask you this. If you were me, what would you have done?